one of the greatest pieces of evidence on the subject of Joseph Smith's theology. And to refute Joseph is to refute Mormonism. For no Mormon will controvert Joseph. Not and stay in the church. It is a sermon which Joseph preached shortly before his assassination in Carthage, Illinois in 1844. I obtained a copy of it, and I would like to read Joseph Smith's last sermon. Not the whole thing, because we'd be here all night for it, but just excerpts from it, as recorded by faithful Mormon scribes and published in Mormon publications. I quote it. I'm going to inquire after God, for I want you all to know Him and be familiar with Him. I will go back before the beginning, before the world was, to show you what kind of a being God is. God was once as we are now, and is an exalted man. He sits enthroned in yonder heavens. I say, if you were to see Him today, you would see Him like a man in form, like yourselves, in the image, person, and form of man. I'm going to tell you how God came to be God. We have imagined and supposed that God was God from all eternity. I will refute that idea and take away the veil so that you may see. It's the first principle of the gospel to know for certainty the character of God. To know that we may converse with Him as one man converses with another. That He was once a man like us. Yes, that God Himself, the Father of us all, dwelt on an earth the same as Jesus Christ did. Here then is eternal life. To know the only wise and true God, and you have got to learn how to be gods yourselves, and to be kings and priests the same as all gods before you. Namely, by going from one small degree to another, and from a small capacity to a great one, from grace to grace, exaltation to exaltation, until you attain to the resurrection of the dead, and are able to dwell in the everlasting burnings and to sit in glory, as do those who sit enthroned in everlasting power. Close quote. Now, Joseph died believing this, preaching it, defending it. What was it? It was, God is an exalted man. I quote him again. The Father has a body of flesh and bone as tangible as man's. The Son also. But the Holy Ghost does not have a body of flesh and bones, but is a personage of spirit. The Mormon Missionary Manual gives all the Bible verses to attempt to prove that God has a body of flesh and bone. Eyes, ears, nose, mouth, hands, feet. The whole thing. On my tape on Mormonism, I point out that there's a marvelous verse you ought to memorize, Psalm 91, verse 4. Because the people who talk about God having eyes, ears, nose, mouth, hands, and feet ought to read the verse which says, He shall cover thee with His feathers, and under His wings shalt thou trust. Because He becomes a chicken very rapidly. Our God is a consuming fire. He becomes a volcano or a blast furnace. Jesus is the door, wooden hinges. I am the bread of life. Now He becomes a loaf of bread, a vine, and He's a vegetable. Anyone recognizes immediately that if you commit yourself to literalism without an analysis of the context, you are committing exegetical suicide. It's exactly what you find in Mormon theology. They take God and make Him a big man. And that is not biblical theology. They refer to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Let us make man in our image after our likeness. Well, what does man look like? Why, he has a body of flesh and bone. Therefore, God must have a body of flesh and bone. Reasoning from the finite to the infinite, a pretty big jump. We have arrived at the nature of God. But Jesus said in John 4:24, God is spirit. And they that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. You and I were created as spirit. Adam was created as spirit and flesh and bone. But the flesh dies, Solomon says, and we know experientially, and returns to the dust. Ecclesiastes chapter 12. But the spirit returns to God, who gave it. So we are created how? In the spiritual image of God, which returns to Him after the carcass disintegrates into dust. Far from proving that God has a body, Genesis 1 only proves that we were created in His image. And His image is spirit, because Christ gave us that image. John 4:24. Mormon theology is replete in literally scores of volumes with references to God as a big man. One of the most interesting occurs in a textbook they are circulating to this day called The Key to the Science of Theology. Quote, each of these gods, including Jesus Christ and His Father, being in possession of not merely an organized spirit, but a glorious body of flesh and bone. So there are many gods, and Jesus is one of these gods. Man may become a god by progression to exaltation at the resurrection. This is why the Mormons practice polygamy, because they believe in the pre-existence of the soul. Your soul pre-existed before it came here. Polygamy was practiced to create bodies for those souls. The United States government, as always, takes a dim view of polygamy. Far too many deductions for the Internal Revenue Service, and abolished it. But the Mormons went right on practicing it for a number of years afterwards, even against federal law, but on a spiritual basis. Today they don't. But they have celestial marriage. A person may be sealed in the temple. One man may be married in the temple to many women. And in the resurrection, those women are called forth from the grave to be his wives. And then he, as an immortal God, sexually procreates children with those women for all eternity as a resurrected deity. I scarcely think this fits into the framework of Christian theology. Rather, it smacks somewhat familiarly of the romance of the gods, of what we read in Greek mythology and the mythology of India and other pagan nations, of the gods taking men's daughters and procreating races. It's reminiscent of Zeus and Aphrodite, not of the God of the Bible. The one thing that is the antithesis of Christianity is polytheism. And the difference between Mormonism and Christianity is the difference between polytheism and monotheism. The Christian believes in one God, and the Mormon believes in many gods. When the Mormon said he believes in the Trinity, he means by this that he believes in three separate gods. The Father is a God, the Son is a God, the Spirit is a God. And there's a whole pantheon of gods out there. And every Mormon male member of the priesthood is striving to become a god himself with multiple wives and eternal sex. I can't see that this can have anything but a vigorous appeal to the carnal nature of mankind. Joseph Smith said, "In the beginning, the head of the gods called the council of the gods, and they came together and concocted a plan to create the world and to people it." And Brigham Young said, "Gods exist, and we had better strive to prepare to be one with them." He even identified the God of the Mormons by divine revelation. Hear, O inhabitants of the earth, Jew and Gentile, saint and sinner. When our father Adam came into the Garden of Eden, he came into it with a celestial body and brought Eve, one of his celestial wives, with him. He is our Father and our God, and the only God with whom we have to do. Close quote. This is the doctrine of Adam God, and you ought to make a note of it. Adam hyphen small g, God. Mormon theologians have been absolutely in a tizzy over this in the last 25 or 30 years, because it has caused terrible disruption in the church. It is historic Mormon theology. There is no way to escape it. I can call Mormons to the witness stand who believe it today, because that was the teaching of the church. But the Mormon church today is attempting to circumvent Brigham, and they are saying, A, he was misinterpreted. B, he was taken out of context. C, he was misquoted. D, hostile critics. I don't know who they could possibly be. Have clouded the issue and just taken a few statements from him and left all the rest alone. And E, the church has never sanctioned that doctrine. Brigham Young and others may have taught it. Notice the word may. But it is not the official doctrine of the church. Don't you see how important it is to analyze the meaning of words? We don't care if it's the doctrine of the church today or not. What we care about is whether or not Brigham and Joseph taught it. Because if they taught it and said it came from God, the system is gone. Because the revelations collapse. No wonder there is this tremendous intent and attempt to circumvent it. I wouldn't say today that Adam is the God of the average Mormon. I would say today that the average Mormon doesn't have the foggiest notion of the doctrine of Adam God, unless he has a devout grandfather or somebody who's really up on the subject and believes it. There is a split in the church's theology. Those who believe in the Adam God doctrine of Brigham Young and those who don't. The Mormon church does not wish to in any way precipitate a major division. And so it's easier to take the positions I enunciated before than it is to come right out and say, Brigham was wrong. It was a horrible doctrine. We can't accept it, and we are going to accept the biblical doctrine, that there's only one God. But today they won't accept the biblical doctrine that there is only one God. In their missionary manual, they teach that God has a body of flesh and bone just like ours, tangible as man's, not identical in the sense of having blood in it, but as tangible as ours. And in their teachings, volume after volume, page after page, you learn that they have not altered their view on polytheism. Therefore, when you are dealing with Mormons, the key to understanding their theology is their doctrine of God. In your conversation with Mormons, when you are trying to witness to them, nothing will cut through the verbal jungle as rapidly as when a Mormon says, we believe in God. And you say, which one? Because at that point, the fat is in the fire. They know you know that they're polytheists and not monotheists. Beware, however, of a Mormon evasion tactic, which is to say, when you don't understand what a polytheist is. A polytheist is somebody who worships many gods. We don't worship many gods. We only worship one God. We don't have anything to do with all the rest of those gods. Just one God. But if you examine the history of polytheism and definitions in a dictionary, you will rapidly find out that a polytheist is someone who believes in the existence of more than one God. Whether they worship the other gods or not is totally irrelevant. To grant their existence is to be a polytheist. You cannot be a polytheist and a monotheist at the same time without doing terrible damage to the law of non-contradiction. A cannot be non-A. You cannot affirm monotheism and polytheism simultaneously without the destruction of language and logic. Beware of that approach.